in the Oval Office, the President of the United States said something presidents rarely say out loud. Not a warning wrapped in diplomatic caution, not a vague threat filtered through spokespeople, a direct, specific promise. We'll be hitting that area pretty soon and very heavily. No ambiguity, no hedging, a target named with a timeline attached. Within hours, Iran's foreign ministry answered, not with silence, not with a counter threat, but with something more unusual, a flat denial that there was anything to strike at all. The site, they said, was the target of a fabricated pretext for aggression, destruction, and sabotage. According to Tehran, there is nothing happening inside that mountain worth the world's attention. Here's the problem. Both of those statements cannot be true. One government insists the location holds nothing. Another insists it may hold the final hidden piece of a nuclear weapons program, buried, protected, and unaccounted for. And the organization whose entire purpose is to resolve exactly this kind of dispute, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has never been permitted inside to check. This is not a diplomatic hypothetical, debated in conference rooms while the world waits. It is unfolding in real time, inside a war that has already produced thousands of strikes across Iranian territory. The bombs are not theoretical. The stakes are not abstract. What sits inside this mountain, however, remains something almost no one outside a handful of intelligence agencies claims to actually know. One side says there's nothing there. The other says it might be the key to whether Iran ever gets a bomb. Both claims can't be true, and how the world finds out may ultimately involve bunker busters. To understand why a single mountain has come to define this entire war, we need to understand what happened to everything else Iran had and why this site was built in the first place. Start with what can actually be verified, because in a story this contested, facts are the only stable ground. The site in question sits in central Iran, just south of the Natanz nuclear complex, under a mountain known locally as Kolang Mountain, pickaxe in Farsi, which is how it earned its English nickname. This isn't some undiscovered secret. Iran itself declared the facility to the International Atomic Energy Agency back in 2021, describing it as a site meant to assemble centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium. For years, that declaration was treated as routine. Then, in June of 2025, everything changed. American and Israeli strikes hit 3 of Iran's primary nuclear facilities, Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, dismantling much of the infrastructure Iran had built in the open. And according to independent satellite monitoring groups tracking the region since, construction at Pickaxe Mountain accelerated almost immediately afterward. Reinforcement, expansion, activity that suggested something was being prepared, even if no one outside Iran could say exactly what. That brings us to now. The current conflict, publicly referred to as Operation Epic Fury, began in February of 2026 and has already produced thousands of strikes across Iranian territory. Yet through all of it, Pickaxe Mountain itself has remained untouched, threatened repeatedly but not struck. The cast of actors shaping this story is small but consequential, the American president issuing explicit threats in real time, Iran's foreign ministry denying any wrongdoing at the site, Rafael Grossi, head of the IAEA, whose agency has documented Iran's declared nuclear material but never gained access to this specific location, Israeli intelligence, which has its own assessment of what may have been moved there, and independent watchdogs, organizations like the Institute for Science and International Security and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, piecing together satellite evidence the public would otherwise never see. Everything Iran built above ground has already been destroyed. What's left is buried. And that single fact changes the entire calculus of this war. But to understand why Iran chose to bury this facility under a mountain instead of rebuilding in the open, we have to go back further, to a war that already tried and failed to end this. To understand why a mountain in central Iran matters this much, we have to look past the current war entirely, to a decade of diplomatic erosion that made this moment almost inevitable. For years after 2015, Iran's nuclear program existed under a fragile framework of international constraints, limits on enrichment levels, caps on stockpiles, regular inspections meant to provide the world with confidence that the program remained peaceful. That framework didn't collapse overnight. It eroded gradually through withdrawals, violations, and diminishing trust on all sides, until the constraints that once governed Iran's nuclear activity had largely lost their force. By the early 2020s, Iran was enriching uranium far beyond what the original framework had ever permitted. That erosion set the stage for direct military confrontation. In June of 2025, Israel and the United States carried out a coordinated series of strikes against Iran's three primary nuclear facilities, Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, in what would later be described as a 12-day war. It was the first time either country had directly struck Iranian nuclear infrastructure at this scale, and Natanz bore particular significance. It wasn't just one facility among several. It was Iran's primary above-ground hub for assembling the centrifuges that enrich uranium, the industrial heart of the visible program. Here is where the timeline becomes important. Iran didn't begin building Pickaxe Mountain in response to the 2025 strikes. Construction had already started in 2020, a full year before Iran formally declared the site to the IAEA in 2021, describing it as a facility intended to house centrifuge assembly if Natanz were ever compromised. In other words, Iran had already anticipated losing its above-ground capability and had already begun preparing a buried replacement years before that loss actually happened. There is one more piece of this history that remains unresolved, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. As of mid-2025, the IAEA had tracked roughly 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, a level just one technical step below weapons grade. After the strikes on Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, the location of much of that material became uncertain. It hadn't simply vanished, but no one outside a small circle of intelligence officials could say with confidence where it had gone. Put those two facts together, and a pattern emerges that stretches back further than this single mountain. Every time Iran's visible nuclear infrastructure has been damaged, the program has not disappeared. It has resurfaced, deeper, more hardened, and further from the reach of the weapons that destroyed what came before it. This isn't the first time Iran's nuclear program has been bombed. It's the first time the bombing may have simply pushed it somewhere strikes can't reach. That history explains why Pickaxe Mountain exists. What it doesn't explain is why, more than a year later, no one, not even weapons inspectors, actually knows what's inside it. That's where the real story begins. Start with the physical reality, because it explains almost everything that follows. Pickaxe Mountain is buried roughly 100 meters beneath solid granite, not the kind of shallow bunker that conventional ordnance can simply crack open, but a facility engineered from the outset to survive exactly the type of strike that destroyed Natanz. And since 2025, satellite analysis suggests Iran has reinforced it further, strengthening tunnel entrances and adding protective layers precisely where previous strikes proved most effective elsewhere. That physical hardening feeds directly into a deeper question analysts still can't fully answer. What is this facility actually for? Iran maintains its original position, a centrifuge assembly plant, nothing more, a peaceful continuation of work once done at Natanz. Israeli intelligence sees something different, suspecting a covert enrichment site rather than a mere assembly hub. Reporting from the Wall Street Journal added another layer, describing the transfer of centrifuges to the location. But even non-proliferation specialists remain divided on what that transfer actually means. Was it a defensive measure, moving vulnerable equipment out of range of future strikes? Or was it the deliberate construction of a hardened, weapons-capable facility built specifically because it could no longer be reached? Here's the deeper issue most coverage misses. That ambiguity isn't a byproduct of secrecy, it may be the entire point. A facility no inspector has entered, whose true purpose no government can independently confirm, becomes politically expensive to strike. Attack an unverified site, and you risk the accusation of unprovoked aggression against something that may, in fact, be exactly what Iran claims it is. In a war already scrutinized globally, that accusation carries real weight. Ambiguity, in other words, has become Iran's most effective form of defense, cheaper than any missile, and far harder to counter. On the other side of this standoff, the dilemma looks different but is no less real. Non-proliferation experts have said plainly that Pickaxe Mountain must be neutralized before combat operations can credibly end. Yet nuclear policy specialists, including Carnegie's James Acton, have publicly cast doubt on whether airstrikes can achieve that at all, suggesting the most realistic outcome is collapsing access tunnels, not destroying a facility shielded by solid granite. That leaves American and Israeli decision makers caught between political necessity and military uncertainty. Enormous pressure to act, paired with genuine doubt that action would accomplish anything decisive. That tension shows up in the language itself. The public rhetoric is forceful. We'll be hitting that area pretty soon and very heavily. But a quieter admission reveals what actually matters most. We follow the material, that's where the action is. The tunnels may be a secondary concern. The real objective was always the uranium, material that, after more than a year of uncertainty, may no longer even be there. If a strike may not resolve the core threat, then the consequences of this standoff extend far beyond one mountain eye, and that's where the stakes escalate for the entire region. Zoom out from the mountain itself, and the stakes multiply quickly. Regionally, a strike on Pickaxe Mountain, whether it fully succeeds or serves a largely symbolic purpose, would mark a new threshold in a war that has already produced thousands of strikes and casualty figures no one has fully accounted for. Iran has not lacked options for retaliation elsewhere. Gulf shipping lanes remain vulnerable. American regional assets remain exposed. And tensions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy corridors, means any escalation here carries consequences that extend far beyond Iran's borders. Globally, something arguably more foundational is being tested: the credibility of the entire nuclear verification system. A facility the IAEA has never inspected now sits at the center of a live war, watched by intelligence agencies but never confirmed by the one body whose job is precisely that kind of confirmation. That raises an uncomfortable question with implications well beyond Iran. Can any declared compliance framework function once mutual trust has fully broken down and inspection has been replaced entirely by inference? The economic dimension follows naturally. Renewed strikes near a major nuclear and energy corridor keep pressure on oil markets and shipping insurance alike, rippling outward to economies with no direct stake in the conflict itself. Then there's the politics of the threat itself. Presidents rarely name specific targets this explicitly before acting. That break from operational secrecy signals one of two things: either genuine confidence that the strike is coming regardless of consequence, or a deliberate psychological campaign designed to pressure Tehran without ever pulling the trigger. And in a standoff like this, outcomes rarely divide neatly into victory and defeat. Israel benefits from continued disruption of Iran's program almost regardless of whether a strike occurs, since uncertainty itself constrains Iran's options. Iran gains propaganda value from its denials and from framing any future strike as unprovoked aggression against a site it insists is peaceful. The United States, meanwhile, carries the greatest exposure, the credibility risk of having threatened decisive action it may ultimately be unable to fully deliver. This isn't just about one mountain anymore. It's a test of whether the entire global system for verifying nuclear compliance still means anything. With so much resting on a decision that hasn't even been made yet, the next question is the one that matters most. What actually happens from here? Given everything at stake, 4 realistic paths emerge from here. Not speculation for its own sake, but scenarios grounded in what military analysts and non-proliferation experts have already said publicly. The first and most immediately achievable is a strike limited to the tunnel entrances. Current munitions, according to expert assessment, are capable of collapsing access points into the mountain, sealing entries, disrupting operations, and sending an unmistakable political signal. But this would almost certainly not destroy the core facility buried deep beneath the granite. It would be a strike of degradation rather than resolution, an action that looks decisive on camera while leaving the central question, what's actually inside, unanswered. The risk here isn't military failure. It's the appearance of action without genuine outcome, a strike that satisfies political pressure without addressing the underlying threat. The second path is far more aggressive, an attempt at full destruction using the kind of deep penetration munitions built specifically for hardened targets. This is the high-risk, high-reward scenario. If successful, it could meaningfully damage the facility in a way tunnel strikes cannot. but the odds of actually penetrating that much reinforced granite remain genuinely uncertain, even among specialists who support the strike. And the risks extend well beyond the target itself. This scale of attack would almost certainly invite sustained Iranian retaliation, with regional escalation becoming not a possibility, but a near certainty. It is the scenario with the greatest potential payoff and the greatest potential cost in equal measure. The third path requires no strike at all, continued threats without follow-through. Trump has already demonstrated this pattern, repeated, explicit warnings that have not yet translated into action. There's a strategic logic to letting that continue. Ambiguity, after all, has worked for Iran throughout this standoff. There's no reason the United States couldn't deploy the same tool in reverse, using the mere possibility of a strike as sustained pressure without ever having to prove it can succeed. The fourth path is the least likely, yet potentially the most consequential, a negotiated breakthrough that grants the IAEA genuine access to the site. This would resolve the central ambiguity at the heart of the entire standoff without a single strike being fired. It's also, by most current indications, the least probable outcome. Both sides remain entrenched in postures that leave little room for the kind of mutual concession this would require. But it's worth naming precisely because it illustrates what a genuine resolution would actually look like, as opposed to a temporary military or rhetorical fix. Weighing these four paths against each other, one thing becomes clear. The decision facing Washington has less to do with the tunnels themselves than with a question that's remained unresolved since the 2025 strikes, where Iran's enriched uranium actually is. Destroying a facility solves nothing if the material it was built to protect has already been moved elsewhere. Every scenario above changes the mountain. None of them, on their own, answers that deeper question. Whichever path is chosen, one fact remains uncomfortable. The tunnels might be destroyable. The uranium might not be findable. Which brings us back to the question this entire story started with. Return for a moment to where this story began. A president promising to strike, a government insisting there's nothing to strike at all. It's tempting to treat that as a simple factual dispute, one side telling the truth, the other lying. But that framing misses what's actually happening. This was never purely a disagreement about facts. It's a contest over who controls the narrative of ambiguity itself. In a war where the normal tools of verification, inspectors, satellite confirmation, mutual trust, have already broken down, Iran benefits from uncertainty. So, in a different way does the United States. Neither side has much incentive to resolve it cleanly because clarity would remove the leverage that ambiguity currently provides. That points to something larger than this single mountain. Pickaxe Mountain represents a broader shift in how contested weapons programs survive confrontation, not by avoiding conflict, but by relocating it somewhere conventional force struggles to reach. Burial has become a form of deterrence in its own right. Not deterrence through strength, but deterrence through denial, through making certainty itself the scarcest resource in the entire standoff, which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging over everything that comes next. Military campaigns are built around the idea that objectives can be achieved, targets destroyed, threats neutralized, wars concluded. But what happens when the target may be physically undestroyable and the material it was built to protect may already be somewhere else entirely? At that point, victory stops being a matter of firepower and becomes a matter of definition. Perhaps that's the real story underneath every headline about this mountain. Not whether the United States has the capability to strike it, but whether anyone on any side actually knows what winning would look like. If the mountain can't be fully destroyed and the uranium can't be fully found, what exactly would it mean to win?